Distance! Speed! Momentum!
Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and it's time to look at least a new vehicle for me. This is the KV-2 1940. Now because of the Festive event, we had a community goal that if we reached the, I believe it was 500,000 number of lights through the special challenges that we were doing, the community, if you had 10 tank tasks, was able to get a KV-2 1940. And if you had the 10 aircraft tasks, you were able to get the Focke-Wulf 189 Uhu. Now, the Uhu I have had for a very long time. It sits here in my hangar. And if you want to go and see it, I did a review on it a while back. The short end of the review is it's a very good plane, even though it may not seem it. It's incredibly maneuverable and great at its PR because it can bomber hunt quite effectively and has some very nice turrets on it. So we're going to focus mainly on the KV-2 today, just because, well, it's new compared to the other one. So what is the difference between the 1940 version, the gift one, and the 39, which is in the tree? Apart from the decals that I have on the KV-2 1939, the first difference you may see is that the top of it is flatter and it's actually lower. So on the KV-2 it's up here, as you can see, but then if we change to the 1940, it is a lot lower than it is on the 39. Another thing is the front of the KV-2 1940 here is straight on both sides, which actually gives more room for the crew inside. If we look at the 39, you can see it's angled here on the front, and here as well. And the reason why this was done on the 39 was for extra armor, but on the 40 they realized they didn't need it, and therefore they wanted to make the crew a bit more comfortable. This is actually shown in game if you look at optics. X-ray. In the 1940, the commander and the gunner are sat down, as well as the two loaders in the back. In the KV-239, they are actually stood up. So that's a nice little thing in the X-ray showing the difference on why they like it. Also, the optics on the 1939 is in an interesting place, and I think it might be bugged out since the optics are straight on the 1940. I feel like if this was your optics, you would be shooting, let's just say, quite skew-whiff a lot of the time. Another difference between the two is the hatch on the back. So this was for loading ammunition into the back of the KV-2. Remember, this thing was designed to destroy pillboxes and then used later in life as a battering ram when they realized that the Germans weren't exactly able to deal with it when it was around. So in order to make loading easier for, putting ammunition into the machine itself, what they had was a hatch on the back that you could lift off and then load ammunition inside. This was made easier by the 1940 version. As you can see, it has a much nicer door with actual hinges on it, so you could just open it up, instead of this, which has rivets, and I'm guessing you'd have to pick it up and pull it out. Very reminiscent of 39 tanks or 38 tanks and before, whereas this is much more of a modern design. So the major differences between the two are pretty much quality of life ones. The biggest change from a gameplay point of view is the fact that the 1940 has two machine guns which are firing on it. So it has this back one here. Well, actually it has three, but it has two which actually fire in game. So it has the backwards one in the back of the turret, located here, as you can see, and it also has a coaxial one, which is located here. Both of these guns do fire in game, which is lovely to see, and there is actually a hole for a hole-mounted machine gun. You can actually see it in the model, but on the X-ray, it isn't actually there. What's in its place is a radio station. So that's, well, it's the radio station is to its right. The actual machine gun is pretty much in the head of the machine gunner right there. So yeah, hopefully when they finally sort out hull-mounted machine guns, this thing will actually have 3 machine guns. The 39, in contrast, has no hull-mounted machine gun, it has no coaxial machine gun, and it does not have the machine gun on the back. So yeah, that's the differences between them. Obviously, the differences themselves are not enough to change the BR of the two vehicles. I personally don't think there's that much difference between them. But I suppose the only other real one is the fact that this area is a bit more sloped, like on the front here. So you have an angle of 15 degrees here, meaning that your armor is slightly better than 75. Where on the KV-2 1940, it's 0 degrees, because obviously they made it flat. So yeah, that's the only difference armor profile-wise. The KV-2 at 4.3 has okay armor, with the release of a lot of other machines, such as the 88mm flak truck and some of the British vehicles at 4.3, including the Firefly, which is at 4.7. The armor has become worse and worse and worse over the years, meaning that you're much more relying on the gun now instead of being able to go into the battle with decent armor. The same issue that the KV-1B and the KV in general, or the KV series, has run into. As we've had more tanks added to the game, the armor has become less and less worth it. You can still angle it effectively if you feel like it. It is also 75mm on the side, so you know, you can easily get over 100 if you angle it okay. It's 30 degrees slope on this front plate. If you want to shoot this thing effectively, you shoot it right here, because by shooting it there, you hit the turret ring, meaning that the thing can't move. You hit the vertical aim drive, meaning that it definitely can't move the gun, and you'll also knock out 1 or 2 crew. This is the same place where you should shoot the 1939, right here. It's the same amount of effective thickness, pretty much, and if you can't hit that, then you shoot this plate, which will kill the driver, machine gunner, and maybe it might kill some people in the turret. But you only hit that if you are struggling to hit this flat part here. It is not a tough tank to penetrate. It was in the war, it isn't in-game. But, you know, everybody looks forward to the gun itself. It is nice that it does have 75 on the sides, and also 75 on the back of the turret, and 70 on the booty. So it does have good armor all the way around, and even pretty good armor on the top third, especially when I've been playing a lot of French vehicles, which decided that 10mm was enough. Well, not in game, because 50 cals exist. So it's nice to see a little bit of an upgrade in that regard. If we look at the modifications of this machine, it's obviously a gift vehicle, so it gets premium bonus on it, and also at the same time everything is unlocked when you get it. You start off with the anti-concrete shell, but the one to always use is the APC-BC one. People have always championed the HE shell, but for me personally, it fell out of favor for me when the Sturmpanzer came out, because they fundamentally changed how those type of HE shells work, meaning that the SU-122, the SU-152, the KV-2, all of the HE shells became a lot worse. Even the Sherman 105 had this issue. So therefore, I switched over to the PB-35. It has ridiculous penetration for the BR that we have, and it also does a lot of damage behind it. It's a 51 kilogram projectile mass with 6.51 kilos of TNT equivalent, which is a massive amount. So let's just compare it to something else. So 6.51 kilos. Let's go to the Tiger 2H, which is a gun which is seen, if it penetrates, will just annihilate a tank. So let's go here, Tiger 2H, the 3943, which is the one with the most penetration. It has 108.8 grams of TNT equivalent. So you can see how much power a KV-2 shell has at its BR. It's wonderful to use. But all the other stats are exactly the same as the KV-239, really long reload, and that kind of sucks, but it is how it is. What we're going to do is we're going to do a general overview of the history of the KV-2 series, why it came about, how useful was it, and all of that jazz, and then we'll get in some gameplay of this machine. So, I'll see you in the historical section. In the Russo-Finnish War, there was many things which were shown to the Russians which worked well and also worked badly, but one of the things which was seen to work well was the use and the production of the KV-1. The main difficulties, though, that the KV-1 itself had, even though it performed admirably at the job it was given, was the fact that it wasn't able to take on heavily fortified positions. In the case of the Russo-Finnish War, the main one being the Mannerheim Line. And in the Winter War in Finland itself, the General Staff decided that they needed some kind of machine which had a specially equipped heavy howitzer, which would be able to annihilate stuff like concrete bunkers. So this would be able to support vehicles like the regular KV-1 units, being able to annihilate these areas of the battlefield so the KV-1s could keep pushing forward. Instead of choosing the much more pragmatic solution, which would be a traditional SPG, they decided that they wanted to use the same turret ring that they had on the KV-1s to accommodate a fully traversed, redesigned turret which would house this huge gun. And of course, what they created eventually was the KV-2. This is why it had the ridiculous turret on it. It had the turret ring of the KV-1, and then it had the turret itself, which had to be big to house all of the crew, the gun, and also the ammunition. And it's also a reason why there's a ladder on the side, because the only way to actually get into it is via that ladder, since it was so tall. And of course, it was going to be an obvious target. It was obviously top-heavy because of the gun and the turret itself. It also had issues on sloped terrain, and all of these culminated into a lot of issues later on for this machine, and mainly why only about 203 of them were built. But it was designed for a job, which was annihilating stuff like concrete bunkers and heavy fortifications, and at that job, it was pretty good at. So let's talk a bit about the design of the machine itself. So at the Northwest Front Headquarters, and also the commander of the 7th Army, Kirill Meretskov, he made some requests for a bunker-busting heavy tank. Several projects were undertaken at the time to try and work out which one they wanted, and one of the last projects that they came up with before disbandment of the idea was the T-100 hull mounting a huge gun on it. So if you don't know what the T-100 is, it was a Russian prototype in the same vein as stuff like the SMK or the T-35, a multi-turreted behemoth. So what they did was they took the hull of that, I believe there was only 2 T-100s made, and they slapped a 130mm naval gun on it. Now, that may sound familiar. That's because that's in War Thunder. That's the Su-100Y that I'm describing there. So we actually have that in-game as well. So this was one of the prerequisites to creating the KV. It was one of the things it was kind of battling against in the arena. So the Su-100Y was rejected because of the Army's lack of barrels and also the naval semi-armor piercing rounds. At the time that all of this was happening, the Soviet Navy was beginning a massive expansion in order to create a more powerful ocean-going fleet. You've got to remember at the start of World War II, or at least, 1939, the Russian Navy was pale in comparison to a lot of the other countries around it, or at least the major nations, such as Britain, America, and even Italy. So therefore they decided that expansion was required, and they didn't have any barrels for stuff like the Su-100Ys to be built, so they weren't able to. So, at the same time, a more pragmatic suggestion came around. This was from Zosef Kotin's team at the Kirov plant in Leningrad. They developed 2 designs based on the KV chassis, and these made more sense, and The reason for that is because they were able to streamline production costs. They already had the production of the KV chassis nailed down. They didn't have to create a whole new other hull in the form of the T100, which only 2 prototypes had been made. There was also an attempt to mount a 152mm BR2 on this chassis, and also a 203mm or an 8-inch B4 howitzer on a lengthened KV hull. But this one was never completed. The third design that was come up with was the one which actually made it and was chosen for this bunker busting role. It was completed in 2 weeks. It had a 152mm howitzer on it, 2 DT machine guns mounted on an unmodified KV chassis. It was accepted for production and designated the KV-2. The first trials were conducted on the 10th of February 1940, and shortly after, 2 prototypes were sent to the front on the Karelian Isthmus. I've always struggled with that word. It's ISTHMUS. Even though these guys were sent to the front, there still is a debate going around whether these prototypes actually even saw combat. The most recent evidence we have suggests that Mareskov's and others' reports on the excellent results achieved by the KV-2s against 45 positions, and pillboxes referred to tests conducted against already captured positions, so not actual combat. So we're still unsure if they actually, at least those 2 prototypes there, made it to the battlefield and were able to fight, or at least if they were effective or not, I should say. The KV-2 had one of the most unique silhouettes of World War II for an obvious reason. It was huge, and it had a massive box for a turret, meaning that it stood out pretty obviously. The hull itself was no different to a KV-1 hull, but in order to fit the 152 L20 howitzer, they needed a box shape, which encompassed a 12.9-ton turret on top of the KV-1's turret ring. I feel very sorry for that turret ring. This now made the vehicle stand at 4.9 meters tall, incredibly tall vehicle, compared to the 3.9 meters of a standard KV-1. However, the high profile of the KV-2's turret was compensated by its immense armor, 110mm frontal armor and also 75mm side armor. In October 1941, the KV-2 production was halted as the Soviet factories relocated and were moved eastwards to avoid German capture. So if you've never actually read about the factories moving, I strongly recommend this, because it's really an interesting story of how they were able to pick everything up and move. They also did it with the aircraft factories as well. Let's talk about the variants of the KV-2, because obviously in game we have a few variants of them. The designation of the 2 models varies between sources and can also be quite confusing. The earlier model of the KV-2 had a turret with a sloped front with rivets and only featured 1 DT machine gun in a hull mount. It weighed 53.8 tons and was the lesser produced model. In German sources, this variant is referred to as the KW-2. This model is sometimes called the KV-2 M1939 or the KV-2 M1940. The turret is often wrongly called the MT1 turret, but that is the designation for the gun mount itself and not the actual turret. And sometimes the MT10 designation is also wrongly used for the turret. So just keep that into account if somebody, starts talking about the MT10 or the MT1 turret. What they're talking about there is the mount name, which is MT1, and the gun itself, which is the M10. So if they say the MT10 turret, what they're actually talking about is the combination of the gun mount and the gun, not the turret. The turret itself was actually just called Big Turret, which is very anticlimactic. So what I actually described there was the 1939 version of the KV-2 that we have in game, the standard tree version. Now, what is a surprise is that it doesn't have the hull-mounted DT machine gun, but everything else is exactly the same. maybe in the future that gets added, because there is a machine gunner in there, so it would make sense if the hull actually had one. The later variant, which is the premium one, of the KV-2 featured the more common and boxy turret, featuring a second DT machine gun in a rear-mounted and an improved rear turret hatch that made resupplying ammunition easier. The armor was kept the same, but thanks to the removal of the angled turret front, it had much more room for the crew, so it was just nicer for them. This meant that working conditions were better for the crew, especially for the loaders, which makes a big difference when you have a huge howitzer for a gun. The German sources, this variant is called the KW-2B, or the KW-2B, but in II form in Roman numerals. It is sometimes also wrongly designated the KV-2A, the KV-2 M1940, or the KV-2 M1941, or the KV-2B. These are all wrong designations. The turret is also has the same issue as the first, where it's called the MT2, but that is just wrong, once again. Also, the turret itself also was called another simple name. Instead of big turret this time, it was called reduced turret. So we've gone from big to slightly reduced big turret, which is kind of funny. A very few early production models of the KV-2 actually had a 122mm fitted, which is a 1938 L22.7 howitzer, which was fitted on the earlier turret, so the 1939 one that we had in game. I think this would kind of be an interesting gift vehicle. Just give the SU-122 gun to a KV-2. I mean, why not? That would be fun. The numbers produced of this model is unknown, but we know that they were limited before they were upgunned with the 152mm howitzer. Also, we don't know how many KV-2s were actually captured by the Wehrmacht. We do know they were used by the Germans, though. They were sent to Berlin for tests before they were fitted with a new commander's cupola and then sent back to the front line. These were designated the Sturmpanzerkampfwagen KV-2 754R and were often used for artillery observation due to their height, which I suppose makes sense. The most interesting variant of the KV-2 is armed with the 107mm gun, and this was during a time when the super heavy tank concept was still being considered by the Soviet leadership. There were no plans to serially produce a KV-2 with a 107mm. Instead, just before the siege of Leningrad, a KV-2 with a 107mm gun was made and sent for fire testing in the March of 1941. The 107mm gun, it was going to be mounted on vehicles such as the 3, 4, and 5 versions of the KV, but none of the projects got off the paper, so yeah. And that's mainly due to the fact of the siege of Leningrad shutting all that down and funneling resources into trying to hold Leningrad. All of the 107mm guns were destroyed, and also the work on the super heavy tanks was stopped. I'm pretty sure it came to the point where they just realized it wasn't worth it, or they didn't have the resources, which is pretty much where everybody got to in the war, apart from Germany, who just kept going with stuff like the Mouse. But we do have the 107mm represented in game in the form of a premium, so it's nice to see that it's here. The KV-2 obviously saw action, with its around about 200 produced, and it did pretty well for it. Because of its size and its armored strength, it was actually nicknamed Dreadnought, which is a very cool name for any tank, by its crews itself. So this was a Russian name, not a nickname given to it by an enemy. It first saw service in a prototype state in the Winter War, just like many other vehicles did. The Winter War was very much a way of not just Russia trying to take ground, but also testing some new ideas to see how they would work. And even though they were too late to test their might against stuff like the fortified Finnish defenses, since they'd already been overrun, but what was actually seen was it was able to destroy many remaining enemy bunkers and also AT guns. The AT guns that the Finnish had were ill-prepared to be able to penetrate the KV-2's strong armor, and even reportedly just stopped firing after 3 non-penetrations. They just couldn't be bothered, it was wasting ammunition, so it was probably better just to relocate. In the opening years of World War II though, when the KV-2 operated in the most numbers it did, it was pretty much invulnerable to direct fire from all but high-velocity weapons at horrifically close range to it. The best the enemy could do was force the KV-2's crew to abandon the vehicle by disabling it somehow, so knocking out a track, maybe it disabling itself, as we'll get into in a little bit, but, you know, something like this. The way to, or an example of this was in June 1941 near a place called Rzyni, I believe, or Rzyni, and there was about 20 KV tanks of the Soviet 3rd Mechanized Corps. They ran into the 6th Panzer Division, which had about 100 vehicles, and there was also a KV-2 tank there. And this managed to hold off the German advance for a full day while being pummeled by a variety of different anti-tank weapons, and the KV-2 ran out of ammunition and was finally knocked out when the Germans could get close enough to it. Even though the armor was really good, and also the gun itself was very good on the KV-2, this led to a lot of issues, which is what I was talking about before. Obviously, mobility was a big issue for it. Between engagements and also during battle, it was restricted by many of the initial gear and transmission problems that the KV-1 faced, because remember, a lot of that tech was just moved over to the KV-2, since it was exactly the same chassis. The situation itself was obviously made worse by the increased weight of the KV-2, from 53.8 to 57.9 tons, depending on the model itself, and also using an unimproved 500 brake horsepower V2 diesel engine, which didn't really have enough power to move this behemoth. The road speed of the KV-2 was no more than 25 kilometers an hour, or 15.5 miles per hour, and it only reached 12 kilometers an hour, or 7.5 miles an hour off-road, so very slow compared to a lot of its contemporaries. And it was also prone to having trouble traversing the heavy turret, if not on relatively flat ground, which isn't a surprise since friction exists. These problems all limited the flexibility of the KV-2 in combat, but even though it was still a very good opponent to fight, at least for the KV-2, if it was dug into something like a strategic position, or if it was assaulting somewhere. So even though it did lack speed and mobility, which were two traits which were massively important in the opening years of the war, I mean, you know, Blitzkrieg was a thing, which was pretty much nailed between those two ideas. It still, you know, it still filled a role that was required, that the Russians needed. The main issue, though, that the KV-2 had was its unreliability, which is the same as a lot of these types of tanks. The gearbox itself would just break easily sometimes, and the immense recoil of the gun meant that the small turret ring would jam quite a lot, or the engine or gearbox could suffer severe damage just from the recoil, which is really worrying when you think about it. The majority of KV-2 losses in 1941 were actually down to breakdowns, or just lack of fuel, because obviously these things ate quite a lot of fuel even though they were diesels, and this meant that they had to be abandoned. A good example of this is the 41st Tank Division lost 2/3 of its 33 KV-2s, but only 5 were as a result of enemy action. Usually knocking out a usually stuff like landmines would actually take out the KV-2s because, well, there just weren't the AT guns there to be able to do it, or even the enemy tanks. I mean, the enemy tanks at the time didn't have the guns required to take out the KV-2. And therefore, because of this, the difference in the style of how the KV-2 used actually changed. So it was supposed to be a bunker buster, and it did that very well, but the Russians realized they could use it as an aggressive, let's run at the enemy and kind of cause chaos in the lines. So it would run at, the Germans, followed by a bunch of tanks behind it. And it used to do pretty well, but because they were seen as this breakthrough tank, they would be the first victim to mines and stuff like that as well. And since it was a very heavy tank, of course you're going to set them off, and it's going to do quite a lot of damage. So even despite all of these issues that the KV-2 had, it came as a nasty shock to the German invaders because of how hard they were to take out, even if they were tracked or something. They had no comparable tanks in strength, they had few AT guns that could destroy them, and it was just, absolute hell for them. You've got to remember that even something like the long-barreled 75mm, the Pak-40, only started coming around in service in, I believe, 1944, because it was tested, or it might be 1942, I'm just checking right now. Yeah, it was designed in 1939 to 1940, which is why it's called the Pak-40, and then it was produced from 1942 to 45. So at the start of Barbarossa, even the long-barreled 75 standard anti-tank gun that the German infantry would use just didn't exist. What they were using was stuff like the 50mm Pak-38, which of course is useless against something like a KV-2. So you can see why they had a hell of a lot of issues trying to kill these things. If it was a bit more reliable, maybe it would have made a bit more of a massive splash on the world, but even then, it still struggled in other ways, such as just the fact of having a massive gun. It can be a blessing and a curse, especially when you're facing other tanks. But overall, the history of it is really interesting, and it's nice to finally cover it, since I've never done a review on the other one. But anyway, let's get into some gameplay. The KV-2 is one of those tanks where its armor really doesn't mean that much unless you are max tier and the majority of the enemy team is 3.3. So this gives it a nice opportunity of, if you feel like it, you can actually run it into some up-tiered games, and because it has the really fun 152mm on it with decent armor penetration, you can generally run it even at stuff like Tigers at 5.7. Now, you would take the IS-2, of course, over the KV-2, so maybe that is a bit far-fetched, but something like 5.0 is definitely not far-fetched. So just take that into account when I'm talking about matchups and lineups and everything like that. So, the first thing to realize is that it is at Battle Racing 4.3, and at 4.3 the lineup for the Russians isn't the best. We start off with a T-3457, which is a solid medium tank. Then we have the KV-2 1940, or the 1939, which is at the same BR as two other KVs, the KV-1 5 and also the KV-1S, and then we have the ASU 57. The AA that you could run with this lineup is the ZIS 43. It is one of the worst AAs, and it follows the great tradition of Russian AAs, which has really poor actually AA abilities, but not terrible anti-tank capabilities, and that to me is just not good enough anymore to class it as an AA. Most of those vehicles that used to be really good at that have kind of been left by the wayside, whereas other ones such as stuff like the Wirbelwind and the Ostwind still do pretty good, but a lot of the Russian ones are left by the side of the road, apart from the 57-2 and also the ZSU-37, but even the ZSU-37 does not have its full HVAP anymore, which is kind of sad for it. But anyway, so 4.3 lineup isn't that great, but if you go up to 4.7, which the KV-2 1940 can definitely handle, I think the lineup becomes infinitely better. So first of all, your medium tank choice becomes a lot better if you have it. Now this is the T-3457 Mod 1943. It is the better version of the T-3457. it has a better turret on it, and also it has a few other delicacies to it. So yeah, that is just, it's the ZIS-4M gun, which may not mean a lot, but I believe it means that it has access to a few different rounds. So it gets the APCR round, which the T-3457 normal in the tree doesn't have. So it means that if you get up-tiered, you know, the APCR round is great to be able to deal with a lot of the stuff that you fight. At the same time, at 4.7, you're given the Su-85, one of my favorite tank destroyers in the game, because it's an 85mm at 4.7. It's very much similar to how you see something like an Avenger with the 17-pounder. It's at quite a low BR. It does have its issues, obviously not having a turret on the Su-85, but at the same time, it's got really good armor penetration for 4.7. If you get up-tiered, it's still going to be really good against stuff like Tigers and Panthers, especially with ersatz running around. So it's a good pick. And you also have the ability of adding in the ZSU-37 if you want SPAA support. So you have a much better lineup of 4.7, so I would actually say take 4.7 instead of 4.3 with this machine if you're going to run it. At the same time, if we look at the aircraft which are involved, at 4.3 you're once again quite limited. The B-25J, if you have it as a premium, is a good and solid pick, apart from it's quite big, and on a lot of the maps you'll be facing stuff like whirlwinds, so they'll just shoot you out the sky straight away. The Yak-9U at 4.3 is a good fighter, but it's not really going to give you any support on the ground. And then you have the PE-2 110, which is probably going to be your pick for the bomber over the B-24, but it's really up to you. Sorry, the B-25. I would personally take the B-25, but that's just because I'm a bit more comfortable with it. You also have another option, which is the PE-8, and the PE-8 is always fun in ground battles because of course, the FAB 5000, the largest bomb in game, so there's that as well. But if you go up to 4.7, you open up your options a little bit. The LA-7 is another solid fighter you could pick up, but you also have 2 Year 2s you can use. You can have another PE-2, which is nice, and the main thing being the Year 2s though. Like the LA-7 and the Yak-9U are kind of interchangeable in ground realistic, but with the Years what you get is insane bomb loads and very good at taking out targets on the ground. So 3 1000 kilos and 4 500s is a recipe to annihilate everything that is on the ground in a carpet bomb fashion, or on a point, or on 2 points. It's a really good machine at just nailing people. So going up to 4.7, you have a lot of options for the Russians, and I feel like with the 1940 that's what you should do. So let's talk about the tank itself. Being able to rely on its armor is not something you should do. The angled armor itself can help you a little bit, but just understand you are huge. People are going to see you coming from a mile away. People are going to set up for you. They're going to go after you. This is not a tank which, if you are one of those players who wants to play really well, who wants to get a really good KD, get a really good win ratio, all of that stuff. If you want that, pick the T-3457 and just play that at this BR in Russia. And then just keep playing the T-34s. The T-34D5T, T-3485, and the T-3485E if you have it as a premium. Just do that if you want to do, you know, win percentages and KDs and all of that. If you want to donk on somebody and feel good about yourself, getting a massive mammoth of a vehicle and just being able to, around about every half a minute, just destroy somebody's hopes and dreams, the 1940 is what you get. You get the 152mm, you load up that PB-35, and you just hit somebody in the face with it. Gun depression, who needs it? You have a 152. Gun elevation, who needs it? You got a 152. Turret rotation, I mean, who needs it? You got a 152. I could say this about everything with this tank, but yeah, if you're trying to be competitive, go for something else. if you want to have a little bit of fun and just to pretty much annoy people, because I know when I get annoyed, when I get killed by a KV-2, there is not a feeling of, oh, you know, that guy did great work there hitting me. It's more like, how the hell did I die to a KV-2? It doesn't induce rage, because I'm not a very angry person, but I can see how it could, because it is a tilting moment when you hear that bong, and then you disappear. It's very similar to how the Jagdtiger used to be, where you would hear this echo from across the map. It sounded like an atomic bomb went off, and then your tank would just disintegrate, because you just realized a big flat shell just hit you in the face. The KV-2 has pretty much the same effect to it, and therefore is incredibly fun to use. Now, the 1940 does also have the premium bonus on it, so if you are using it to grind, that's great, but I would still suggest the T3457 Mod 43. Instead, if you would want some kind of premium machine, the machine guns don't really add anything to it, and also you're incredibly vulnerable to planes because you're the size of the Bahamas, so they all go after you, and they all want to kill you because you're a KV-2, even though you're pretty much useless in the battle. It is kind of fun when you get down to it and you don't get one-shot by stuff like jumbos, because they can just shoot you on that flat plate and you die. But overall, it isn't a great machine. Another titan of its time in the game, when we didn't have Americans, we didn't have the British, we didn't have the French who can easily pen the front. When this thing was facing Germans with their Panzer IVs, when the Panzer IV's reload wasn't amazing, and maybe those like 3 or 4 KV-2s coming at you, you couldn't kill them all the time. Or maybe you have the Panzer IIIs which couldn't do enough damage in time before the round actually gets off. Then yeah, this thing was viable. Or not viable, but a little bit more useful, I think would be the word. Nowadays, yeah, it's a relic of the past, but it's still fun when you just destroy somebody's inner mind. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.